Time to roll out some of the big guns of Warhammer 40K today, what's the best artillery in the game right now, and how do different faction options stack up against each other. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking big guns and artillery, and taking a look through each army's indirect fire options and how they're doing in game right now. Indirect fire and artillery options do seem like they've been hard to balance for Games Workshop in the past, and as a result in 10th edition quite a lot of them have received points increases over and over again. Maybe Games Workshop trying to keep them a bit more in the place where they're not going to cause too many problems, as often if they get a little bit strong then all of a sudden it can be worth spamming them, because of just the general look and feel of the models with mortars, great big siege guns and indirect firing rocket launchers. It does make sense they should be able to target things that they're not able to see, but in Warhammer 40k 10th edition as it's set up they do have some kind of game warping value. There's quite a lot of units out there in the game that only really work because they're able to hide. Fragile units that will aim to hide behind terrain and then jump out to shoot things, and if lots of armies have good indirect fire then they just don't really work unless they're in transports or something. In 10th edition's point scoring game, it's also really powerful to be able to knock out choice objective scoring units. Say if your opponent had a few models on one far-flung objective that you couldn't reach otherwise, artillery could be really powerful to wipe them out and either potentially deny them several turns worth of objective scoring or force them to redirect something far more important to do that grunt work. And even if neither of those are possible, just having firepower that's quite so flexible and wide-reaching does have a massive amount of utility benefit, being able to hit the exact thing that matters the most, even if their damage output isn't crazy, or maybe just trying to cause at least one wound on a badly damaged unit when they're the last thing that's able to finish it off. With all that value, it can often mean that if one artillery piece is good to have in the army, then spamming them can be a good idea, as it actually gets you to the point where you're kind of reliably wiping out objective scoring units rather than just having a go at it. I feel like I've seen a fair few lists where it's either been 3 or none for say Space Marine Whirlwinds or Sister Battle Exorcists, and basically whenever something that fires indirect has become very powerful, all of a sudden they get spams to Kingdom Come, like briefly when Orc Squig Boggies were suddenly kind of amazing, and some theoretical competitive lists were running 9 of the things. To balance that out, it seems that Games Workshop has done a number of different things. Most of the artillery pieces are just kind of pricey for what they do at the moment, being kept to sort of borderline worth it as opposed to competitive staples for most armies. And also indirect fire has got all sorts of layered debuffs on it. They're -1 to hit, their targets gain the benefit of cover, and they also can't hit on better than 4+ either. And between all that, it even means that artillery pieces will be far more dangerous if they can see their targets, and sometimes it can just make sense to move somewhere where you've got a direct line of sight if the barrage fire isn't going to have as much impact and there's a good target readily available. With all that in mind though, there's certainly still some interesting artillery fire out there, so let's talk through each faction's options one by one, a few numbers in terms of damage output against a couple of likely targets, and how strong I'd rate them in game. First up for the Space Marines, we've got the Desolation Squad and the Whirlwind. The Desolation Squad started out as one of the single strongest units in 10th edition that was rapidly bumped up from 120 points all the way up to 200, and since then there haven't really been many people playing them in competitive lists. They've got some fairly nice direct fire super crack rockets, but their main attraction is their indirect fire. A bunch of guys with D3 Castellan launcher shots, which are basically just bolt shots but with D3 blast shots, and then a harder hitting Vengor launcher which gets D6 strength 7 at AP 1 and damage 2 shots. Really quite a big weapon of war there, and they all get to ignore cover when they're stationary. At 200 points though, they are kind of spectacularly expensive for what they do. Not very efficient against the majority of targets, probably best against extreme light infantry due to the Castellan launchers having multiple blast copies. They kill around about 3 Chaos Cultists per 100 points, so that means that a squad of 5 of them would kill around about 6 with an average activation, which isn't too bad. Against anything Space Marine size or tougher though, they really don't compare very well. Pretty much all the other artillery systems tend to beat them per point. I've chosen to give them a 3 out of 10, they just don't really do enough damage and are incredibly fragile if the enemy ever gets to shoot them. Otherwise for the Space Marines, we've got the Whirlwind at 180 points. The firstborn artillery tank throws out D6 plus 3, strength 8, AP 2 and damage 2 shots with the blast keyword and indirect fire. A really good profile for killing Space Marines compared with other things, and they make infantry take a battle shock test in case that should matter at all. In terms of raw numbers again though, it's just not really all that impressive, around about 2 Chaos Cultists per 100 points, but a fair bit better on the efficiency versus Intercessors versus the Desolation Squad, and still bad against tougher vehicles that would be wounding on a 5+. For Space Marines, one saving grace though is the Oath of Moment. If you really wanted to have a big focus Whirlwind artillery battery, you potentially could be dealing out some fairly serious damage with them, or with re-rolling hits which gets around the 4+ to hit barrage restriction, and then a Codex Oath of Moment gives you a +1 to wound as well. Even with that though, without other buffs being layered on the target, you still don't get too spectacularly efficient numbers or anything. If you do get 2 counter at the moment though, then it gets to be one of the better damage output ones against intercessors and not terrible against vehicles. For general purpose use though, I've given it a 6 out of 10. Before we move on, I'll just give a quick shout out to today's video sponsor in Baron of Dice, a high quality dice maker based in the USA, who made a bunch of fancy merch dice for the channel and asked if he could sponsor a few videos. They've got a pretty huge range of dice aimed at wargaming. The idea is they have lots of designs that could be applicable for various different factions out there, usually something for the vast majority of miniature armies that you could think of, and with options for versions for both squared and rounded corners. Typical dice offerings are around $32 for 25 of them, or £26. They're based in the USA, so shipping can be a little bit more if you wanted to post them around the world. In any case, the dice are pretty good quality, and you can find them links down in the video description. There's also the code Auspex, which gets 5% off any purchase if you do happen to find some designs that you like. They've also got the very snazzy channel dice as well. I was very pleased with these ones, and in particular the black dice design has certainly been popular. In any case, a big thank you to them for sponsoring this one, and you can find them linked down in the video description. Moving on to other army artillery pieces, outside of Legends things there isn't really much else for the core codex. Probably the most notable one for the Divergent chapters is actually the Deathwatch Fortis team now, which certainly isn't a dedicated indirect fire thing, but is definitely interesting enough that you can just casually include a couple of Desolation Marines, so you can have the Vengor launcher, which is by far the best bit out of the Desolation squad, along with another Castellan launcher in the unit. If you want just a little bit of indirect fire, that does feel like it's actually genuinely quite efficient, as the rest of the squad's just going about and doing its business, having at least a fairly scary indirect profile to be able to throw into random enemy units around the board. The squad can also get an extra AP buff in Black Spear for 1 command point that could help both the indirect and the rest of the squad, plus might be able to use the sustained or lethal hits if it's on those turns. It does kind of depend on whether or not you want to use the Fortis team anyway, but the Desolation Marines certainly look like great value there, and definitely a nice little side bonus to using the unit. The kings of indirect fire for the Imperium though are the Astra Militarum, and first up for them we have the heavy weapon squads. 50 points per 3 of them, and for this one would be locking them to the mortars as opposed to anything else, which isn't usually the worst idea in the world to be honest, given they're so fragile that if you put them in direct line of sight they're probably going to get picked up very quickly. Even if they're just sitting around on a home objective though, they're genuinely quite efficient. Against a bunch of infantry targets, you get 3d6 shots hitting at strength 5 AP 0 damage 1 for the mortars, so 3 copies of blast to stack more hits there. So they will be hitting on a 5+ without orders. I've just let them have that for this one, as they're not really a particularly efficient squad to buff with orders. In any case though, even on buff, they do around about 5 wounds to Chaos Cultists per 100 points, so that will be 2 of these squads basically. 1 or 2 wounds to intercessors, and not really that much to vehicles as you'd expect. A couple of teams of them certainly could chew away at lighter infantry though, definitely could be a problem for lighter units out there. If they could get a few turns worth of firepower in, then they're definitely a unit that's going to be far better in some games where they've actually got good targets as opposed to others where everything's got power armor or better. I've chosen to give them a 6 out of 10 for this one, though by my numbers they really are quite efficient against the lighter infantry sort of target, the second best of all the units I compared. For destroying medium and lighter infantry, perhaps some of the single strongest artillery around though are the field ordnance batteries. Games Workshop did give them a couple of decreases, dropping them down to 100 points per 3 bases here. They can take the heavy las cannons and the rocket batteries, but for this one we're using those bombast field guns. D6 shots each at strength 7, AP 1 and damage 2, and their special rule is that while they're being affected by an order, they also get to have sustained hits 1, so that means they'll be hitting on 4s with exploding 6s. Given that they're a far more efficient order target compared with the heavy weapons, and have a special rule that makes them extra juicy to order, I've counted their damage as having got an order, they'll charge them an extra 15 points for it, with another commander that might be doing some other things, perhaps Ursula Creed, while she's also handing out an order to something else, and also making a stratagem cheaper. With that on the go though, their damage per point is really quite efficient. They're the single best against the cultist targets due to 3 copies of the blast special rule, and also seem to have the best raw numbers against intercessors as well, with usually 4 wounds dealt per 100 points, and not too awful against big tough vehicles as well, having a 1.4 wounds against a toughness 9 vehicle, kind of similar to the Whirlwind with Oath of Moment. For the guard ones, broadly I haven't included things like Scout Sentinels, or the various other ways that you could amp up firepower such as Fields of Fire. Just for fun I thought it could be interesting to see what they could do with a Scout Sentinel marking their target for reroll 1s to hit. and also either having AP -1 or ignore cover on their targets, whichever one happened to be easier, maybe from a Leman Russ Exterminator or Hellhound or Fields of Fire. Per point, their numbers go up really quite a lot. There's a good chance of wiping out an entire squad of Chaos Cultists just with 3 guns, or up to around about 3 Intercessors. Still not enormous stuff, but if you had multiple batteries of them all firing at the same target, you could certainly be wiping out small squads of Space Marines in a single round of shooting. Overall, I've given them a 7.5 out of 10. It does seem that they're perhaps one of the better indirect fire things in the game, though the strength 7 and damage 2 things does mean that they're just not really all that good against tougher stuff. They're not very good against things like Terminators and vehicles, and still are kind of rare to see included in competitive guard army lists. Next up, we've got the Mighty Basilisk with 140 points for its Earthshaker cannon and special rule. This one has a similar sort of damage profile to the Whirlwind, D6 plus 3, strength 8, AP 2 and damage 2 shots. And with a heavy keyword, it'll be hitting on that maxed out 4+ to hit if it's static, so again will be pretty effective against things like enemy Space Marines that still won't be out shooting field ordnance batteries against those point for point. The Basilisk doesn't really need orders though, which is a positive, and perhaps the single biggest thing are the Earthshaker rounds, as it can hand out a -2 to move, advance and charge, and being able to pin that into one enemy unit that's going to be trying to move up and make a charge can be a really big deal, particularly for certain slow armies like maybe Death Guard Death Shroud if they don't have Mortarion nearby, or Adeptus Custodes, or maybe World Eaters or Blood Angels trying to make longer charges. Again, it feels like the majority of guard lists tend to pass these up, though I feel like it's reasonable enough to include one in just literally for that copy of that rule, and have any indirect damage that it does as a bit of a bonus. I've given it a 7.5 out of 10 here. Next up, we've got the Manticore for 175 points. And its big Storm Eagle rockets doing D6 plus 1 shots at strength 10, AP 2 and damage 3, hitting on the maxed out 4+ with the heavy keyword. The Manticore does get to be unusually accurate against big massed up infantry as well. You get to reroll the hit roll against any squads that have 5 or more models in them. It does make them unusually good at killing things like elite infantry with 3 wounds, say things like Chaos Space Marine Chosen or Terminators. For actually dealing indirect fire damage, they're kind of similar to the Basilisk on these numbers per point, though bear in mind that we've probably left off some of the more choice targets for the Manticore off the list. If we had Terminators on there or Chosen, then it would have done quite well on those. It still does feel like one of the stronger artillery pieces if you do want to layer lots of buffs on something and have something that's fairly general purpose, and can also threaten some tough stuff. Again though, there haven't been quite so many people running these in guard lists since points increased quite a bit and the artillery nerf happened. I still think they'd be scary enough, particularly in multiples and supported by buffing rules. I've given the Manticore a 7 out of 10 just for being a lot more relevant against more targets than say the Bombast guns, even if they're not quite as standout against lighter stuff as they are. Next up for the guard, we've got the Wyvern, 110 points for the Quad Storm Shard Mortar. That one's 2d6 shots at strength 5, AP 0, damage 1, with ignores cover and twin links, so likely means that the vast majority of units take a bunch of saves, even if they're AP 0 ones. It's also able to debuff one unit for a -1 to hit, which isn't awful, but doesn't often wind up to have the same sort of target that you'd really want in mind for the unit that it'd want to shoot with that damage profile. For damage output, it's a fair bit better against the low save infantry versus anything tougher. One of the higher ranking things against the cultist targets, though far behind on everything else. They've been very rarely played versus the other artillery out there. I've given them a 4.5 out of 10 here. Finally, for the guard index artillery, we've got the Death Strike at 145 points. That one works really quite a lot differently with the Death Strike targeting rules, placing a marker on the board and giving your opponent the chance to scurry away from it, and then on your turn you get to launch the missile if you'd like to. Everything within 6 inches being hit by 2d6, strength 16, AP 4 and damage 1 attacks, so basically quite likely to take a really good chunk out of most units, though not outright destroy them. They probably have their best value in disrupting enemy castles. Say if everyone's holed up in one big ruin, then they really have to think about getting out of that, if they don't want multiple different expensive squads taking a lot of damage. For actual reliable damage dealing though, it can maybe be a bit on the lackluster side. If you only catch 1 or 2 units in that explosion, then there's a good chance that you don't make up the cost of the 145 point vehicle. Again, like many of the rest, very rarely seen on competitive lists. Definitely not unusable though, and against certain armies could be a bit of a headache. I've given it a 5 out of 10 here. Guards certainly have a lot of artillery systems, and we are going to be getting a whole bunch more profiles for them in the upcoming codex. It'll be interesting to see how the artillery team slots into all these numbers. It does feel with quite so many indirect fire profiles all competing for a similar sort of role, it might be kind of tricky to balance it without it either being too strong or too weak versus other profiles, but I guess it will add another 4 different profiles to the mix. Otherwise, probably worth giving a shout out to a single mortar in a command squad or infantry squad, though it sounds like they might be going away soon. In any case, they've certainly been used to hand out fields of fire with Ursula Creed. There are plenty of Forge World artillery choices that I've decided to leave off going through them in this video, due to them looking like they're going to Legends in the fairly near future, and as mentioned, you can stack a fair few buffs on the target of indirect fire. Things like Sentinels, Hellhounds, Fields of Fire, or the Lehman Ross Exterminator, or the Master of Ordnance, though most of those do need line of sight from other units as well, maybe lessening the point of the artillery to some extent, even if it does help. In any case, it will be interesting to see if Guard Artillery takes off again in the new codex, or Games Workshop continue to try and keep it more niche for competitive armies. Moving on to the Adepta Sororitas next, and here we have the Exorcist. They were 190 points and quite competitive at that value, though in the last balance update they went all the way up to 210, really quite pricey for the Church Organ of Missiles. They've got two different damage profiles, though everyone tends to take the regular Exorcist missile launcher. That one's D6 plus 2 shots at strength 10, AP 3 and damage D6. And there really aren't all that many artillery pieces that hit quite that hard. AP 3 is quite rare to see on artillery compared with the rest, and as a result it is one of the ones that can more effectively actually engage enemy tanks. Out of units that can fire indirect every turn, it's the second best out of the ones that I looked at against the Toughness 9 3+ save vehicle profile. One Exorcist tank does around about 5 or 6 wounds to that on average, so likely 1 or 2 failed saves with standard rolling. It's one of the stronger ones against things like Terminator equivalents as well. I've given it a 7 out of 10 here. I still feel like they're at least usable for the Sisters of Battle, particularly in the context of a bunch of other nerfs, though they're definitely far less scary than they were at 190 points. Next up, for the Admech, we've got the Scorpius Disintegrator, 175 points, and for this guy you basically have the choice between the Belleros Energy Cannon or the Ferromite Cannon as the top gun. The Energy Cannon is the one that we're interested for this one, given that it fires indirect, 2d6 shots at strength 7, AP 2 and damage 1. A fairly general purpose profile, but isn't really going to do too much against things like 3 wound infantry or vehicles with only a 1 damage characteristic. For the damage comparisons, I went Conqueror and assumed going for the extra AP near a battle line unit, though even with that, even against 1 wound infantry, it didn't really compare very well to most of the rest. Though I guess that partly is because it does have some alright shooting on its other profiles as well, with those disruptor missiles and a bunch of extra stobbers. The Ferromite Cannon is the much preferred option though. The big strength 12 AP 3 and damage D6 is solid anti-tank for the Admech, and that tends to get taken far more. I've given this one a 5 out of 10 if you're taking the Belleros Energy Cannon though. Next up, for the Grey Knights, we've got the Purgation Squad, and these guys are kind of partial indirect fire really. They do get 2 shooting nor in line of sight, but they can only do so if another Grey Knight Psyche unit is able to get a line of sight to them. So they can't just clear out enemy units where none of your army can see them. You'd have to have another unit flanking them and being able to draw a line of sight to at least one of them. They've got 3 different weapon profiles which will be better against different targets, though for this comparison I decided to go with the Psy Cannons. I feel like the Incinerators with the indirect fire at just 12 inches is maybe a little bit limited in scope, and the Silencers are absolutely going to shred really light infantry, though not really do so much to other things. If they are able to have their target marked though, they do have some of the better numbers against the Chaos Cultists and the Intercessors here, ranking top 5 damage output for those. They are a unit that could actually be genuinely kind of interesting in the Warpbane task force as well, given that they already have at least somewhat efficient indirect numbers, and then they basically get an extra plus 50% if they get to fully re-roll their hit rolls. And they feel like a unit that would quite easily be able to if they just tow into their own deployment zone or stick somewhat close to some purifiers. Might still not really be worth it though, just versus having them drop in with a bunch of incinerators and scorch down enemy infantry directly. Overall, they're still not really one of the mainline Grey Knight damage dealers versus things like Dread Knights to take down heavies, but for 120 points they're fairly cheap and usable. I've given them a 7 out of 10 here. Next up, for the Death Guard, we have their Plague Burst Crawler, a bit of a hybrid tank and artillery piece this one, given again that it does have a fair bit of damage output from those Entropy Cannons or Plague Spitters if you want those instead. For the actual big Plague Burst Mortar though, it's D6 plus 3 shots at strength 8, AP 1 and damage 2, with indirect fire and lethal hits. Kind of similar to the Whirlwind and Basilisk profiles, but trade out a pip of AP for auto wounding on 6s. These guys were a bit of a staple in earlier Death Guard 10th edition lists, though seem to have dropped off quite a lot now. They didn't really enjoy the barrage changes where you could only hit on a 4+ or better, as before they had some good synergy with Mortarion and his ignore modifiers. Just on their base damage output though, they're just not particularly effective against any of the targets really. Though again, it's maybe not quite as fair a direct contest as some of the others, given that they're quite tanky compared with most of them, and they're also paying for some fancy entropy cannon, plus it wouldn't be the hardest thing in the world to get the extra AP contagion on their target some of the time. And that's to improve the numbers a little bit there, particularly against the intercessors. They generally do tend to be overshadowed at the moment in Death Guard armies though, far more lists going for Predators, Allied War Dogs or Bloat Drones when it comes to armour as opposed to the iconic Plague Burst Trawler. I've given them a 6.5 out of 10 as a result. Otherwise for Chaos Knights don't really have anything that's dedicated indirect, but given that they quite enjoy spamming War Dogs, they each get a Havoc Launcher with D6 Strength 5, AP 0 and damage 1 shots, and over the course of something like 10 or 12 War Dogs that a lot of competitive lists like to run, that could certainly add up to some big problems for a lighter infantry squad if they all choose to focus fire on one. 10 Havoc Launchers on average kills around about one squad of Chaos Cultists or puts 5 wounds on enemy intercessors in indirect, and might potentially do a bit better if the War Dog variants have any buffs for them, or you use that sustained hits focus fire stratagem. For the Thousand Sons, they don't really have so much dedicated indirect firepower, though it is kind of terrifying that they could potentially have Magnus just vaporize something that he can't see. In their index detachment, they have access to Warp Sight for 2 command points. That means that you get Ignores Cover and Indirect Fire on your Psychers shooting, but you can only attack that another Psyker is able to see. Though other nearby sorcerers could chip in as well if you had a whole load of them that were hidden out of line of sight. It does seem scary enough if the army is playing really quite conservatively and castling up for a turn, and still being able to hopefully lay waste to an enemy unit that's gotten a bit too close to all the scary damage profiles. Next up for the Chaos Space Marines, they've got a once per game indirect fire unit in Obliterators. Again, maybe a little bit unfair to compare them against the other artillery given that they can't do it all game long, but it certainly could be pretty problematic for the opponent not to be able to hide a unit, and particularly with their damage profiles being quite so general purpose against all sorts of things. Assuming they're at 18 inches, so aren't getting the melter bonus, their flesh metal guns will kill around about 6 Chaos Cultists, so about 4 per 100 points. The mid profile with the blast is quite good against Space Marines, getting 3.1 wounds per 100 points on average against the Intercessors. And the big hitting focus Malice ones is one of the stronger profiles against tough vehicles and things, and between all of those in terms of the damage output per points, they rank around the second strongest against the vehicle target, the Intercessors, and third against the Cultists, or that's assuming that they do a Dark Pact as well for either sustained or lethal hits as it makes sense. They potentially could be made a fair bit more scary as well, maybe having things like Abaddon the Despoiler nearby, or a few different detachment buffs, and in general they're just a fairly effective firepower unit for Chaos Space Marines anyway. It's certainly a big deal that they could take a chunk out of something that the opponent would like to hide, either as their opening move or being able to threaten to do that later. I've given them an 8.5 out of 10. Next up for the Chaos Demons, and perhaps the biggest scariest indirect fire weapon, is the Infernal Gateway from Kairos Fateweaver, the two-headed Lord of Change that can generate some command points and also debuff enemy stratagems, making them cost more expensive when they're near him. Per points, his damage output isn't really all that threatening, paying a big 270 points for those quite nice command point rules, plus his indirect fire and a bit of melee, and also helps out Demons of Tzeentch with the Shadow of Chaos. I feel like he could be interesting enough as a disruptive unit for the opponent, maybe trying to hide in the mid-board a bit, having enough indirect damage to really hurt enemy infantry units, and messing with command points and stratagems and things. I'll probably rate him around about a 6.5 to 7 out of 10. He does generally tend to be one of the lesser taken greater demons out there, as most of the rest all offer interesting stuff too. Definitely usable enough though. I do remember a big tournament list that won using him as well. The command point debuff on a big tough model, maybe hiding out of line of sight in the mid-board, could be at least fairly disruptive. Finally on to Xenos artillery pieces, and for the Aeldari we've got the Night Spinner. This one took a massive points increase up to 210 points back from when Aeldari were the strongest army in the game at the start of 10th. The Grav Tank can move really fast with a big 14-inch movement, and then the Doom Weaver spits out d6 plus 3 shots at strength 7, AP 0, damage 2, but gets devastating wounds and twin linked, so it means that any attacks that do hit have got a really good chance of landing a wound, and there's a pretty reasonable chance that those wounds will be devastating wounds. If it's near a Farseer as well, then he could use a Fate dice to basically guarantee a 2 mortal wounds through, provided it can land one hit on the target, and a little bit of near guaranteed indirect fire is kind of nice. On top of that, it also slows down units as well, with one of those rules that subtracts 2 from movement, advance and charges, and again that can be a massive debuff rule against the right enemy unit, definitely slow moving melee things in particular. Overall it's definitely priced at a premium, though I've still seen people using them in occasional Aeldari army list. I'd probably say similar to the previous, perhaps around a 6.5 out of 10 for power. Damage wise it's got some okay numbers against the Intercessors. I guess the damage coming out in chunks of 2 and not improving their saves at all makes it a little bit better than most against them. It's also not got awful numbers against the vehicle target as well, due to those devastating wounds. Still though, all the way up at 210 points means it's incredibly pricey now. As a result, I've given it a 6.5 out of 10 overall, again kind of a rarity in Eldar lists, though I have seen occasional people running one. For the Aeldari though, they do have another indirect weapon in the support weapon batteries, 135 points for either a D cannon or a Shadow Weaver, though it's certainly one of the units that's balanced for the D cannon given that they kept on putting the points up for that, so the other weapons are rather overcosted by comparison. The D cannons are fairly short range but really quite scary. 24 inches and D3 shots with strength 16, AP 4 and a massive damage D6 plus 2, or with devastating wounds, and the Aeldari battle host rerolls mean that you get to reroll one failed hit and one failed wound roll, and that makes them at least somewhat reliable. Weighted for 100 points, these are the ones that have the single best damage output against the toughness 9 3+ save vehicle, and it's fairly impressive that they're kind of equally effective against all the tougher vehicles as well, all the way up to toughness 12 and above. Though only having a few shots and a massive damage characteristic means it's not going to do quite as much against the infantry, though it still ranks as one of the higher ones against the intercessor squad as well, just due to that big high AP and being able to get an extra shot with the blast keyword against a 5-man squad. I feel it's definitely not uncommon to see a few of these in Aeldari lists, being a big area denial threat, so that if the enemy puts something on the mid-board, they're going to get hit very hard by some nasty devastating wound fire. And they're a really good target for Farseers, feeding in an automatic 6 devastating wound to get that D6 plus 2 damage punched through saves guarantees. Out of direct damage artillery weapons, they've got one of the best profiles out there. Even if they do have the downside of the short range, I've given them a good 8 out of 10. D-cannons can still be really quite scary. Next up, for the Genestealer Cults, the Achilles Ridge we're on is worth of a mention. This one can attack with a heavy mortar with D6 plus 3 shots at strength 6, AP 0 and damage 1, and it can take a spotter to hit on a native 3+, so that with the -1 to hit it can still hit on a 4. They went up to 85 points in the last balance update, they were still really good. Their biggest thing is being able to hand out the AP -1 debuff though, and potentially ignores cover as well if you choose the Survey Augur instead. People often choose to take the heavy mortar just because that gives you the most choice as to where you put the debuff, though the mining laser version is quite nice as well. In terms of its mortar damage output, it's not awful against Chaos Cultists. I guess they're the right sort of profile for it to target, but it's really very bad against everything else. I'd give it a 9 out of 10 for power rating, and that mortar can be great for handing out the debuff, though for the mortar it's not really the damage output that you'd take that for. Next up for the Orks, we've got the Rocket Truck Squig Boggy. The boggies in general for the Orks are pretty underpowered right now, and the Codex didn't really do this one any favours as well. They decided to take away its +1 to hit infantry for some reason, which was the only thing that kept it at least semi-effective against them. So now for its indirect fire squig launchers, if you don't have line of sight on something, due to its ballistic skill 5+, it'll only be hitting things on a 6. With the squig launchers, you get D6 plus 6 shots at strength 5, AP 1 and damage 2 with ignores cover. So maybe not the worst Space Marine killing profile in the world for actual hits that do hit the target, and it has the potential to hand out one of those slowing rules to a unit that's hit by the squig launchers. On a 4+, the unit's hindered, and it's -2 to move, advance and charge. It does have a bit of melee and a squig mine as well, so it is a bit multi-purpose. For its damage output though, due to having to hit on a 6, it's just kind of dire against all targets though. And even the debuff rule is pretty unreliable, and I've given this one a 4 out of 10. I feel like the Ork Boggies definitely need something to help them out. For the Tyranids, they've got 2 indirect fire units. The first one is kind of hilarious just how far Hiveguard have fallen. The Impaler cannons used to be a threat that could genuinely threaten enemy tanks and things, and over a huge area of the table. Spamming loads of these was definitely a done thing in 9th edition for that damage profile, but in 10th edition their profile's crazily toned down compared with what it was. Per guy they'll still hit on a 4 with heavy, but with 4 shots at strength 5, AP 1 and damage 1. And that means they're only really any good against 1 wound infantry. They're pretty inefficient against standard Space Marines. They could have some buffs such as lethal hits or sustained hits from a Hive Tyrant or Invasion fleet, but it's still not really going to be enough to move the needle on them for being good against anything besides light infantry. At least with the Impaler cannon loadout, I've given them a 3 out of 10. I feel like the shot cannon is at least a little bit better than that, but still struggles a bit against its vehicle targets that you'd expect it to be good against due to only having AP 1. Otherwise for the Tyranids though, and a fair bit more commonly taken, is the Biovore. Again though, maybe like the Ridge Runner, this is one that's taken for its special rule and not really its indirect damage. For its actual barrage fire, you get D3 shots at strength 6, AP 1 and damage 2, and they get heavy and devastating wounds, meaning it's kind of okay against lighter infantry targets and not terrible against things like standard intercessors. In general though, I feel like actually using it for direct damage will be something of last resort. Maybe if you needed an absolute Hail Mary to try and destroy one last infantry model, and that could be big. Most of the time this is just going to be good for sitting at the back and farming out spore mines. With that, it's just really quite a nice thing for board control. It can screen out a bit of the home field, maybe stop enemies from arriving and from reserves around there, or be on hand to do actions and things. And then the spore mines can do things like stop enemies advancing towards mid-board objectives, or screening out deep strike, or being put down to do certain positional secondaries such as engage on all fronts. Still not all of them are actually tied to having any OC. For that role, I've rated a single Biovore as 8.5 out of 10. I think pretty reasonable to include in most Tyranid lists, though maybe not quite as absolutely 100% mandatory as they used to be. Otherwise, for the Xenos, there's maybe not quite so much in terms of dedicated, ignores line of sight. The Hecaton Land Fortress can have a fairly scary D6 plus 3, Strength 7 AP 2 and Damage 2 shot, but it's only once per game, and nobody generally tends to take it, as you have to give up a scanner that has ignores cover for all the rest of the guns. For the Necrons, the Silent King can do a little bit of indirect fire with the Staff of Stars. It's not going to be making use of his good 2+ ballistic skill if it fires indirect, being limited to a 4, but it could combo with his reroll 1s to hit and wound, and should be able to clear out a few light infantry at least. Maybe a nice enough benefit to put some pressure on some lighter infantry units while he's going about doing the main things that he's doing. Finally, for the Tau, they might have a few scattergun smart missile systems hidden around, but they tend to be far less impactful than they were in the past, usually with 3 attacks at Strength 5, AP 0 and Damage 1, often at Ballistic Skill 4+, and they might take even further penalties to the hit roll if they're split firing from a guided unit, and as a result their damage output just doesn't usually tend to be massively meaningful, maybe the odd light infantry model here or there, though I feel like they're pretty underpowered compared with other things that you could take. In any case though, with these Xenos things talked about, that's the vast majority of the more dedicated artillery systems for the various armies of Warhammer 40k. Here's just a rough table of damage outputs against the targets that I looked at for the video. It seems that it's quite a good time for the Field Ordnance Battery, both against the Cultists and the regular Intercessors. I maybe was a little bit generous giving it an order for 15 points, but even if you'd upped the arbitrary points cost that you'd charge for that order, it'd still be basically on top or very near the top. Otherwise, against the Cultists, it looks like the mortar-heavy weapon squads do rather well. As to the Obliterators and the Purgation squads, though neither of those are really more standard, just ignores line of sight, no question asked units, the Hiveguard Wyvern and Desolation squad also do well against the Cultist targets. Otherwise, for some slightly heavier Space Marines, again it's the Field Ordnance Batteries that won this one. The Obliterators and the Purgation squads are next, and then for the actual more dedicated platforms, Support Weapon D-Cannons, Basilisks, Night Spinners, Biovores, Manticores, Whirlwinds and Exorcists all do kind of alright. Finally, for a tougher target against the Toughness 9 vehicle, the Support Weapon D-Cannon battery wins by quite a long way there, even if there's no Farseer to feed in an automatic 6. Then it's the Obliterators once per game strike, and the Exorcist still follows after that. Even at 210 points, it's one of the strongest anti-tank firing ones. The rest are all really quite a lot lower, the Field Ordnance Battery, Manticore and Night Spinner following that up. In any case, would certainly be interesting to see if things like that new artillery battery from the Guard make any impact on the list, or there's any new synergies from Codex Astra Militarum. I guess the Aeldari heavy weapons are going to be having their rules rewritten as well in the near future. Let me know your thoughts and takes on the units down in the comments below though. Do you make use of these in your games or not? Look forward to hearing your thoughts on artillery in general. In any case, a massive thank you for listening to this one. I'll finish up with a quick shout out to the video sponsor in Baron of Dice once again. If you wanted to get some high quality faction dice of one sort or another, they've really got a lot of options available. Feel free to check them out, links down in the video description, and if you use that code Auspex you get 5% off as well. Subscribe to the channel if you'd like to see more like this. I certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming just about every day. There's other ways to support the channel down in the video description as well. Supporting the channel's Patreon page and the discount affiliate links if you're picking up any Warhammer in the near future. A massive thank you to anyone using those. But otherwise I'll leave that one there for now. A huge thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.